Now, you might say that, well, it's not necessarily about race. And that's the problem, is that race, it's hard to just to isolate it and be able to say, well, it's because of race. Was George Floyd killed because of his race? We don't know. We do know that he was killed. And that the police in America have huge amounts of power, and that the systems in America, in the American police force, and of course it's done by state, but too often the systems allow them to let that power go to their heads. You know, we have come so far in this country, we've come so far. And I do think it's a beautiful country. I love Britain, and we have our British flag flying outside Michaela, and we sing God Save the Queen in Jerusalem at school because we believe in our country, and we believe that it is our country, whatever color we are. And what upsets me greatly is that these riots and these times divide us and make it into a kind of race war. And, you know, it's for people like me, you're just sort of stuck in the middle, and you think, well, where do I go?
Okay, I'm joined today by Katharine Birbalsingh. Katharine is the founder and head teacher of Michaela Community School in London. She's also a well-known author, speaker, and commentator, and regularly appears on TV, on podcasts, in print. I think you were just on the TV about 20 minutes ago, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I'm asked to speak sometimes, yes.
Yeah, and you've just brought out a new book. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. The Power of Culture, written by the staff at Michaela. And it's particularly important at the moment because it really does speak to all of the current events. I mean, there are chapters in here, and we didn't know, obviously, that any of this was going to happen, but weirdly, it is really just exactly this. So we've got chapters on one called Why I'm Still Talking to White People About Race. Yeah. Another is Climate Activism, the True Purpose of Education. Another one, Schools Should Teach Dead White Men. Michaela, A School of Freedom, or Something Worth Fighting For. Our school is controversial, and it's controversial because of the things we believe and the values that are central to it. And that's why we call it the power of culture, because our culture is very different. And I would say the book isn't just for teachers, it's for anyone, parents, but also just anyone interested in politics and anyone interested in what's currently happening with the Black Lives Movement and the statues and all of that stuff. Honestly, you'll find your answers in this book to understand how education plays such a vital role in having created the culture that we've got right now in society that has allowed the last couple of weeks to take place.
Okay, that is such a great place to start. Also, I'm going to put a link to the book in the description to this. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll put a link in the description. If you're listening, I'll put a link in the show notes on whatever podcast app you're using. So let's talk about what the book says towards the end. But just to begin with, what is your take on what's going on? So just to provide some context, at the moment, there are loads of protests going on in relation to the killing of George Floyd. So what is your just general take? And then we can get into specifics on what's happening and just the whole thing.
Okay, well, you know, first of all, George Floyd is absolutely horrific thing that happened. Really just devastating and awful for his family. I mean, for him, obviously. I mean, just terrifying, really, that the police can take. And from what I understand, they knew each other before. I mean, it seems like it was personal. I just really that the police, who we as a society hope will protect us, there should be such an abuse of power. And so it is understandable that people are protesting and that they're angry about that. Having said that, I'm of the opinion that things have got completely out of hand, and that the violence that we have seen, the complete lack of respect for law and order, it no longer has anything to do with George Floyd, which in a way is upsetting, because George Floyd deserves better than that from all of us. But in any case, things have completely got out of hand, and I worry very much about where this puts us as a country. I always felt that we were somewhat protected from the polarization that exists in America, where you've got these ardent Trump supporters and these Democrats who think that, you know, the Trump supporters are stupid, and the Trump supporters who think that the Democrats are crazy, and neither side can see what the other side is saying, and they just go at each other. And I always felt we were kind of above that. But suddenly now I feel in the last couple of weeks, we have been thrown into that kind of polarization where no one's actually listening to each other. And that is, well, it's a real concern for our country. So, you know, whenever I try and talk about these things on Twitter or with friends or, you know, with my staff, I always try and look at both sides and then explain where I sit. And so, yeah, my take on things is that things have got out of hand. I understand the protesters. I believe we live in a democracy. We believe in the right to protest. It's good that people can protest. It's bad when these things become violent and people die. And it's not something for those who support the protest shouldn't just ignore that. Yeah, but the ones who are against the protests shouldn't only concentrate on the violence and forget about why the people are protesting.
Yeah. So in terms of why, because something which seems central to me is whether ultimately the points, what percentage of the points being made by the protesters and in the wider societal discussion are valid and what percentage aren't. And I'm trying to get people with a whole different range of views, which is one of the reasons I wanted to get you back on, because you seem to have quite a nuanced and like not very hysterical take. You just seem to be quite measured, which in the current climate is actually quite rare. And also, I just think there's so much pressure to come down unbelievably strongly on one side. And even though I have a lot of sympathy with the side you're meant to come down, I think it's important to look at it in a balanced way. So just in terms of the protests themselves, do you think that a lot of the things that the protesters are saying are true about society accurately reflect the state of A, society in America, and B, society in Britain?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. How much of it is true? It sort of depends on, you know, I think it depends on one's personality. So what I mean by that is, I'm a very resilient person. I have been knocked around a million times by the education system, by the political system, lost my job, told I would never work in the state sector again, had to build up my own school from nothing, had detractors fighting me. I kept on going. You know, now we've got a really successful school. But I'm a particular type of person and not everybody's like me. And so when I come across racism or what people call microaggressions, you know, so someone asking to touch my hair, that sort of, you know, and why do they ask to touch my hair? They ask to touch my hair. It's happened many, many times in my life because as a white person, they think, oh, isn't that hair funny and weird? I want to feel what it feels like, you know. Now, some Black people will take real offense to that and say, how dare you? This is my hair, you know, don't come touching me. I'm not a little plaything. I'm not a doll. Which I can understand. I don't have that reaction. I sort of think, yeah, sure, you can touch my hair. I mean, I don't care. So, but that's me. I am very resilient, and I'm a particular kind of person. And when I come across issues of racism, I sort of think, who cares? Move on. Get out of my way. I don't care. And I suppose I feel that way about lots of things. So not just racism. People can get pulled down by, you know, a family member dying, growing up in a difficult home. You know, I could have been pulled down by the fact that I'd lost my job and then couldn't work in the sector that I loved and the only thing I knew for 3 years. I could have given up at that point, but I'm not the kind of person who does that. But not everybody is like that. And so, yes, I do think that there is racism in our society. I think it comes in all different kinds of forms. I don't think it is a blunt instrument. I think too many people on the right think of racism as, well, that means you think of a whole race as being inferior to your race. Well, that's one kind of racism. There are other types of racism. As a general rule, I would say that what racism is when you meet somebody and the color of their skin is what you judge them by. So you meet me and you think, oh gosh, she must be a real Black Lives Matter activist, and she's going to be a real problem in our organization. Well, actually, I'm not a Black Lives Matter activist at all. I'm really critical of them, but you've just judged me by the color of my skin. And so that is what I would say racism is to look at somebody and judge them. But I would say that it also goes the other way, so that you look at a white person, you say, well, you must be a real racist, and you obviously think I'm stupid because I'm Black and you're white. Well, that is to judge that person by the color of their skin. It is just, I was just on this this afternoon, this radio, well, this podcast, there were 3 of the white people in this, and we were all talking. And I was asked at the end, we were talking about COVID and about schools and about government, nothing to do with race or statues and so on. And when we got to the end, I was asked about statues and what we would do at school. And I talked about how I was really worried that white people were being silenced and that they were too scared to say anything anymore. And, you know, not one of the other people on the podcast said a word. Right. It just ended with me saying that because they couldn't. I can't blame them. They're too uncomfortable because they're worried if they say something, they'll be accused of being racist. And this is not good for white people, for Black people, and certainly not good for race relations, because white people will then just get together and just be annoyed together, talking and saying, look, we're living in this police state and so on. Yeah. And yeah, so I am very worried, really very worried, because we seem to have reached a state where it is more like America. And I so worry about our police. I mean, when I think about the police, you know, our local police at school who help us, they help the teachers with the kids outside. And when I say, because we're in a challenging area, in a challenging inner city, kids carry knives. There are big fights that take place outside. Every afternoon after school, my teachers have to go outside to make sure the kids get on the buses and are getting home safe and don't get involved in any kind of brawl, etc. And the police, we depend on the police. Now, the idea that we're somehow fighting with the police and the police are bad. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't corrupt police officers. Just like there are some really bad teachers, but generally speaking, our police force is a force for good, I think. And I know that will get me into a lot of trouble for saying that, because everyone will say, you know, they're institutionally racist, and I'm not even saying that isn't necessarily the case. There will be racist assumptions that are made.
So something which I find unbelievably confusing is where the line is drawn between basically just pointing out. I think it's really important to be specific in how we as a society discuss the issues which are being protested. So, for example, a lot of the points that you were making then, I agree with, about the nature of racism and maybe people making assumptions about different people. That might be an issue which some people face. But if a protest is about, so to give you one example, if there's this protest about George Floyd, I don't think it's absolutely clear cut that this is necessarily a racial issue, because as there are obviously, I just had this guy, Wilfred Riley, on, who's an African-American professor, who basically made the point that he thinks that while it's obviously a complete disgrace, the killing, it's not absolutely given just on the basis of that one thing that this was necessarily a racist.
That's true.
Proof of wider systemic racism. And then he went into loads of statistics saying that basically he thinks that the Black Lives Matter movement is using things like this to paint an overly divided picture of even American society, which has undoubtedly got some like really systemic issues to do with the situation for Black Americans, with the result that it's possible to paint this situation where the police are going around just randomly killing Black people because they're racist, when in fact, although there definitely are instances of that, there are other ways of looking at it which show that actually statistically, if you take into account key variables like demographics and crime rate and stuff, actually the police are no more likely to shoot a Black person in America even. So he makes the point that fact pattern needs to be understood before we can have a serious discussion of the ways we should tackle the racism which still does exist. But I've thought about it. I've thought about that really, really hard, but I can't decide whether that, and that's what people like John McWhorter and loads of other really, really intelligent black or African American professors say, which is basically you need to think about these things more systematically and more specifically. But then I've also spoken to people who've said that, yeah, sure, you can't prove that this one killing was necessarily racist, but it's just so obviously rooted in the way that black people have always been treated really badly by the police in America and the position that black people are in economically and so on, that to try and make the point that it's just a random act just detracts from the fact that loads of black people just have an innate sense that this is something, there's something wrong with this, and it's just really screwing over black people disproportionately. So even if you can't...
That's the issue. Is it disproportionate or not? And you're quite right that there are statistics that would suggest that only 9 unarmed black men, for instance, last year were killed in America, and that there's some larger number of white men that were killed in America by the police. There are lots of white people who are killed by the police, just as black people. And of course, in Britain, fewer people are killed by the police because our police don't carry guns. That's the big difference. I mean, look, I love Britain. I think it's a brilliant country to live in. I think it's one of the best countries in the world to live in with regard to race. I think Canada's really good. And actually, I think America's really good too. So I don't, you know, and I know America really well. I've spent a lot of time there, a lot of family there, a lot of friends there. I know it very well. And living in New York is very different from living in Kansas. It's a very big country. I had a lot of friends when I was at Oxford who, when they left, they went to America because they felt they would have a lot more career opportunities. And over time, that has proved to been right. And those who stayed here, in comparison to those who went to America, actually didn't do so well. Now, you might say that, well, it's not necessarily about race. And that's the problem, is that race, it's hard to just to isolate it and be able to say, well, it's because of race. Was George Floyd killed because of his race? We don't know. We do know that he was killed, and that the police in America have huge amounts of power, and that the systems in America, in the American police force, and of course it's done by state, but too often the systems allow them to let that power go to their heads. So from what I understand, in Minneapolis they're allowed, the police are allowed 5 opportunities to give to their family, you know, to get off a speeding ticket or to get out of some bit of trouble. And they just can use these. It's a bit of a perk that you get as a policeman, that you're above the law and so are your family. I mean, like, so that kind of thing, that is corruption at a systemic level. Now, does that also include racism at a systemic level? I suspect probably so, simply because racism is part of our everyday life. And you're right, and your academic there is right. John McWhorter, by the way, is absolutely brilliant, and he does this wonderful, there's this wonderful talk that he gives, which is on YouTube, where he himself talks about how he's changed his mind over the years. So he used to think that the police were really racist, and then he's eventually come to the point where he thinks, well, actually, he's not so sure, just because for every black man who's been killed by the police, there is an equivalent white man who's been killed by the police. And the fact is that it's about power trips, it's about control, and it's about the police having this large sense of authority where they are able to abuse their power. I have to say, I think our police, there's a lot less of abuse of that power, which isn't to say that there isn't abuse of it, but our police don't have guns, and that's a big point. But of course, it isn't just the police. It isn't just the police now that people are protesting about. They're also protesting, as you know, about statues, and that is an interesting discussion. And you know, I'm not sure where I lie on that one. I mean, look, on the one hand, I believe very much in beauty. And when I say beauty, what I mean is Roger Scruton is great on beauty. Architecture, where you live and the way things look around you is important. It's important for one's a peace of mind, and just, you know, one of the reasons why the projects in America failed so badly is because you've got these horrible buildings, they're square and concrete and everyone's in there. You know, you want beauty. Now, you might say, well, what's so beautiful about a slave trader? Well, I mean the statues in older countries like European countries, are part of the thing that makes our streets beautiful. Now, I, for instance, would rather see perhaps a plaque next to the statue to explain the history of the person who it was, and to make it so that we are not commemorating them, because of course that's what a statue does. It's sort of elevating them up above the rest of us. And the plaque, I would hope, would bring them down a bit, but we would still have the beauty and the age of that statue. Having said that, you know, in a couple of years ago, when in America they were they were wanting the statues to come down there, and they toppled a couple and so on, I was quite vocal about the fact that actually I thought that these statues should come down. And the difference for me, for the statues in America in comparison to the statues here, was that the statues, many of these statues in America were erected during the Jim Crow era. So there is a statue of Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate army commander, and he fought to retain slavery, and he is a real symbol for the American South and the Confederacy, and for slavery. And that symbolism is important, and people wanted to get this Robert E. Lee statue down. And I understand now they're talking about, I think there's a road in New York which is named after Robert E. Lee, and again they're talking about changing that name. And he is very symbolic. And the thing is that those statues went up in the Jim Crow era. They didn't go up in 1865 or whenever. They went up much later, and they went up in order to tell Black people that white people were in charge. And we're going to put these up there so that you know, you might have your freedom, you might think you got the vote, but hey, we are in charge here. So that, for me, painted things differently. And I thought, you know what, I do think those statues need to come down. Also, there is the point about the British generals in New Delhi, in India. They were put into a statue park because once India had its freedom from Britain, they didn't want the British generals staring at them all the time, so they put them in a statue park. Similarly, Stalin fell in Budapest in whenever it was, and I can't remember, but his head fell. We didn't all cry when Saddam Hussein in 2003 or something like that, when he fell in Baghdad, and the people, were beating his statue, and we all rejoiced for that. So our own relationship with statues is complex. I'm a great believer in democracy. And so I believe Brexit should happen because 52% of the country wanted it. Similarly, if it is the case that now more people want those statues to come down than want to keep them, then I think the statues should come down. And I do think that this is a question that we need to put to the people. Now, it's possible that we might say, yes, but wait a minute, if white people have been silenced and they feel too uncomfortable about saying what they actually think because they think that'll make them into a racist, then they won't really say what they believe. And that is why the thing I'm most concerned about is that white silence, because we don't want to live in a police state. We don't want thought police. We want freedom. Freedom for everybody, for white people and for Black people. Ultimately, it's what Black people have fought for all of their lives. It's what my parents and my father, when he came to this country, and he would go from house to house looking for somewhere to live, and would be faced with those signs saying no colored, no dogs, no Irish, and he'd have to go away. All of us want freedom. When I was growing up in the 80s and in the 90s, I was used to being called all kinds of names and not having, friends, even friends who would talk to me and say, well, does it rub off, and all that sort of thing. We have come so far in this country. We've come so far. And I do think it's a beautiful country. I love Britain, and we have our British flag flying outside Michaela, and we sing God Save the Queen in Jerusalem at school because we believe in our country, and we believe that it is our country, whatever color we are. And what upsets me greatly is that these riots and these times divide us and make it into a kind of race war. And, it's for people like me, you're just sort of stuck in the middle, and you think, well, where do I go? What do I say? I don't know. Look how long it took me to explain to you my position on statues.
Yeah.
We all speak in 30-second sound bites now. We go on the news and we say, one person goes, rah, 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 the other one says, rah, 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 and there's no room for nuance.
Yeah.
And it's precisely now, this time, where we need nuance and we need discussion, and sadly it is not forthcoming.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. That's actually why I set up the podcast as well, because I just thought, like, you can't get anywhere if you have a 5-minute interview with anyone. It's just impossible, especially the way the media is set up at the moment. But for what it's worth, on the statue thing, I basically just have always kind of taken the line that it's quite controversial, but I just don't really see why anyone cares that much about keeping them. But I know that loads of people who watch this unbelievably strongly disagree with that. I just think, why do you want a statue of someone who traded black people basically as inhuman?
Well, it's not, remember, the thing is that different statues thought, well, I say different, the statues don't think, but different statues represent different people who thought different things. So you might say, oh, but the one of Colston needs to come down because he's a slave trader. Well, what do you say of the one of Gandhi? Gandhi was a racist. He didn't think much of black people. Do we take Gandhi down too? Churchill saved us from the Nazis, but he didn't think much of the Indians. Do we take him down? You know, if we're saying that anyone who has ever had ill thoughts on a race level should come down, well, I think that means we need to take all of our statues down. And it may be that that's what we decide as a country. I believe in the democratic process. So if most people in the country feel that all statues should come down, then we take them down. I would disagree with them and think, no, I don't think we should. But the problem comes when you're trying to decide which statues come down and which don't.
No, definitely. Oh, I just think that on certain issues, so I just try unbelievably hard to divorce my instinctive suspicion of loads of people on the left in the culture wars from just the specific claims they're making. And so I know that loads of those people are just not very considered and are doing this kind of in a performative way. But at the same time, I think that there's only so far you can go with that. And I just think, I don't really know why I would bother protecting a statue of a slaver. But then I definitely understand the point about how it's a slippery slope. And also it all comes down to motivation. I'm not sure I trust loads of the people who want the statues taken down to say, oh, okay, well, we've got the statues down now, so let's not do it. I think that those people will, I think the far left, at least throughout history, has always been willing to take power to any level it can until it gets stopped, which is my main.
Exactly. That is a very good point. The thing is that, you know what? If taking down all the statues made it so that everything was okay and that we could all be friends again, and that we wouldn't be having riots all the time, well, not all the time, but right now it is all the time, and we weren't, the race relations in the country were not so tense, then maybe we'd say, well, yeah, great, let's do it. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. And that is because both sides are so entrenched and are not listening to each other. And I so wish they would. Yeah,
definitely. Also, I find because we could talk about that statue point for anything, but I have this kind of feeling that the statue thing is just a weird side issue, which just the culture wars have made into a huge deal and almost no one really cares about. They just think about it because it's been made front and center by the weird way that the main issue here isn't being discussed, because I wanted to get a diversity of views, and you seem like someone who had a slightly different view to Professor Wilfred Riley, who I had on last week. I wanted to keep talking about the extent to which you think because to me, it all just comes down to the fundamental question. Every single other one of these issues is basically a satellite issue, which revolves around the absolute central issue of whether racism is as profound a problem as the protesters think it is, or whether the other African-American and Black academics, and a lot of Black public figures as well, I've noticed, or a few of them anyway, are saying, which is basically what they're saying, which is basically that actually this is massively misrepresenting the nature of racism in the UK and in the US. Actually, it's nowhere near as bad as loads of white celebrities and loads of people within the Black Lives Matter movement are making out. And actually, it's really detrimental to loads of Black people in a way, because it's detracting attention away from really important issues by forcing people to focus on something as if it's racist. So to just take one example, if you take the John McWhorter type line, then you could say, well, there were 18 murders in one day in Chicago last weekend, and they got absolutely no press coverage and not a single celebrity pretty much who said Black Lives Matter, blah, 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 said anything about that. And at the same time, loads of people in the Black Lives Matter movement are actively seeking to defund the police, which would potentially lead to much, because there's this thing called the Ferguson effect, which is essentially an uptick in African-American deaths in inner city areas whenever they do reduce the police presence. And so as someone who's genuinely really, really worried about trying to help African-American and Black communities succeed and not be held back and not suffer, I would be really concerned about someone who doesn't care about 18 deaths in 24 hours in one city, but is desperately trying to decrease the police presence, because I think it's unbelievably obvious that that might really, really screw over those people. But at the same time, if the police are racist, which John McWhorter thinks basically they're not, then, but if they are, then I don't see how you keep...
Police are racist. There will be individual policemen who are, just like there may be individual teachers who are. You know, it's interesting you say about the people, you know, these guys who want to defund the police. They're the same guys who fought me to stop me from setting up my school. They're the same people who protested outside and told our 11-year-olds that their lives were in danger by being in the building. They're the same people who do not want behavior systems to be tight in schools, and they think that having tight behavior rules is oppressive to Black people. They're the same people who accuse, there's this guy called Doug Lemov in America. He's written this great book called Teach Like a Champion, wonderful techniques in there that make for a great teacher. But they accuse him of being a racist because he has good ideas on how to be a good teacher. It's completely absurd. Just like the idea of defunding the police is just absurd, because as you've just made the point, if there are no police in these districts, more Black people will die. Just like if there are no good behavior systems in a school, more Black kids will fail. So you're absolutely right. I mean, those people that you're talking about, I have absolutely no respect for. It is entirely about them. They have a kind of socialist stroke communist paradise in their heads, where they imagine, because they think that all that's wrong, the reason why the police have put people in prison is because they're racist, not because these people are actually criminals. So we have to open up all the prisons and let them go. And they think that the police only do bad. When I can tell you, and I've met many a policeman in my life, doing a great job. And I thank all the policemen and women out there for the work that they do, and the vitriol that is sent towards, I mean, my goodness, it is awful what they're having to tolerate, when I think that they are there helping to protect us. And I'm grateful for that. You know, once I had an author come in, Black author, London author, this is many years ago now, to come and talk to the kids at school, and they were all Black kids. And I had him come and talk to them, and he was talking about when he was a younger guy in the 80s, and how every day he'd be stopped 5 or 6 times, stop and search by the police. I remember those days. You know, I was around in the 80s. I remember Black male friends of mine, they'd have drugs planted on them. All sorts of horrible things would happen to them. That kind of thing does not happen now. Now, people say, oh, it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. It's exactly what the kids said. When he said, oh, I was stopped all the time, they all kind of muttered themselves, yeah, well, so do we get stopped all the time, man, you know, it was all this kind of bravado. And he genuinely said, oh, right, so how often do you get stopped? And nobody said anything. And eventually it transpired that 2 of them had been stopped once in their entire lives. Once in their entire lives. He used to get stopped 5 or 6 times a day. So it's when you come back to your original question of racism, you know, just how bad is it? It's not that bad. It's as simple as that. It's really important that we talk about these things. And as I say, what concerns me at the moment is that white people are being silenced. And that kind of thought police way of proceeding in a civilized society, it has no place in a civilized society.
In my mind, the issue is, fundamentally, is racism a really serious issue in the US and the UK? And if so, does it matter if we are basically being really inaccurate in how we're discussing what's going on?
Okay, so what kind of racism do you come across? You come across the kind of racism where you might not get a job because of the color of your skin. You won't know that's why you didn't get the job. But it's hard to know, and you never really know, and that's difficult. You see, your academics who will say, oh, you know, there's no proof and so on. The problem with racism is it's very difficult to prove. And so then you have to have that conversation with Black people to say, well, why do you think that? And the problem is that the Black person might be saying, well, the reason why I haven't succeeded is because of racism. And maybe they just like indulging in victimhood. It's possible. Or maybe it is genuinely the case they didn't get X, Y, and Z because they were Black. And that is the difficulty. I myself, for instance, have been asked a couple of times to sit on boards, you know, charity boards and that sort of thing. And they've just said to my face, because you tick the diversity box. So all of my experience, all of the brilliant things I've done in education, and I've done a hell of a lot, none of that counts for jack. All they can see is the fact that I'm a brown woman, and they think, great, we want you on our board. And I find that grossly insulting. That is racism.
No, but this was kind of the second point of my question, which is, but that's not necessarily the form of racism which a lot of the protesters would see as racism. So that's what I'm saying in terms of being specific, because they might think that racism would be not doing that, because it would be not actively seeking to have diversity. And so what I'm saying in terms of the specificity of language, if it's not necessarily the case that the language being used to describe the way that the police behaving perfectly matches up with the statistics, but ultimately the end result is that the police have much greater scrutiny on them, and then are basically just less corrupt as a result, or are less able to be unaccountable, are less militarized. And also there's more focus on other forms of just general inequality, which may or may not be down to racism, which is another whole debate which people like John McWhorter have, like things like the fact that in America, loads of Black communities are really poor. And that obviously leads to some of the issues, which means they encounter the police. Does it matter if the protesters aren't being specific in how they're discussing it, and they're making claims which often aren't actually exactly accurate or backed up by many of the stats, if the end result is just many of the issues which still do exist get ironed out or have greater focus on them, if you see what I mean?
You win hearts and minds by giving people information, by talking about it, by writing about it, by doing stuff. You don't bombard people and whack them over the head and pull statues down and insist that you signal. Now, you see what you said there. You said, yes, but that's not racism, Katharine, when you're being offered something. The Black Lives Matter people would say that it's the other way around, that actually this is a good thing. And I would say it isn't a good thing, because when people do things because of your race, that is racism. And it's really sad that we can't all see that. It's important that we treat people as people. If you look at me and all you can see is my color, there's a problem. I want you to see that I'm somebody who's a bit radical and a bit weird, and I say things I shouldn't say, and I'm obsessed with education, and I'm a bit loud, you know, and I talk a lot and I don't stop, you know. That's what I want you to see about me. I don't want you to look at me and think, oh yeah, she ticks our diversity box. And if that's what the Black Lives Matter movement ends up doing, and what that is, the end goal then, it would seem, is that we're requiring people to signal that they are not racist. Why don't they're asking to defund the police, they're asking to open up the prisons. I mean, what they're asking for is just absurd. So, I mean, I feel we need to just put them aside. On a bigger matter, you know, and I know you're talking about the police a lot, and I'm saying, but Black people don't have to do much to do with the police normally. We need to ask those ordinary Black people, what kind of issues do they come across in normal life? It depends on the person, obviously. Look, when I was young and living in France, and because I look like I'm North African, I was told to go back to Algeria quite regularly. I was accused of stealing in shops. Life was not easy. Life is very different now. In those days in France, you could buy a Negro's head in the bakeries, because you know, it was a thing, a baked good that you could buy, and it was called a tête de nègre. You know, I mean, there are shocking things that have changed over time, and we ought to recognize that. I think that we are living through dark times at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see where we end up. If we do end up somewhere where we can live in harmony, it'll only be because there are some voices of nuance who can see both sides, who we have listened to.
Okay, so this is a good point because I don't want to keep you for ages. So just go on to how your book, which you should just quickly mention again, how that relates to this.
Yeah, well, power of culture. Culture is everything. And what has happened recently with the Black Lives Matters, the violence, etc., would not have happened if our culture hadn't been open to having that happen. And the culture that we have tried to build at Michaela, and the chapters in this book, which are really pertinent for today's issues that are happening right now with the Black Lives issues. You know, there are a couple of chapters in here. Should schools teach dead white men? Why I'm still talking to people about race. We talk about how instilling a sense of national identity in our children is so important, whatever color they are, about how we sing Jerusalem and God Save the Queen, about how we hang a British flag outside our school, and how we love our country, and it is our country, it is my country. Britain is my country, and I love Britain for all her faults. And of course she does have faults, and I'm not saying that there isn't any such thing as racism, but I do wholeheartedly believe that if we continue down this road of just bashing people and not listening to each other, we will not end up in a very nice place. It is so important for us to read. One book that your followers might read is by a man called Peter Fryer. It's called Staying Power, The History of Black People in Britain. It's really fat. In fact, I've got a copy here. It's really fat book, but it tells you the whole history of Black people in Britain. And it'd be great for, you know, especially if you're white, but if you're Black too, read it and find out about the history of Black people in Britain. And then speak out, because white silence is not a good thing, not for anyone, least of all Black people.
Okay, fine, that's great. And I'll definitely put a link to that. I'll also put a link to the Fry book in the description as well, so people can grab that. Okay. Thanks so much for coming on. That was awesome again. And yeah, also you're obviously welcome back whenever you want.
Thank you, Max. Thanks for having me.
No problem, no problem. And good luck with everything at the school as well.
Thank you. All right then.
All right, speak to you soon.